The day I picked up this book of yours, I became your raving fan.
It was my first book, and it was a book I couldn't not write. Once I finally sat down to write it, it was a book that in a lot of ways wrote itself.
I am joined right now by strategist, storyteller, and author Tamsen Webster. She's also the author of the new book, Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible.
What are the other ways that could help people to identify their core gifts?
One of the ways to look at for those gifts and those superpowers is to say, what is it that people seem to come to me for, and they don't seem to go to other people for that same thing?
Wow.
One of my mantras that I have for myself, but I share with my clients, is seek to disconfirm. Seek to disconfirm what you believe to be true. Ask up front, if this fails, why would it fail? Because most people actually do have a sense, if they stop and think about it, at where the weak points are. We just don't stop and think about it.
I just love it when you said that seek to disconfirm.
Yeah, I love the work of Simon Sinek. I think his work on why and purpose is very good and important, because we need to know that. And most people know it can be very hard when you're just like, what is my why? Like this giant big question. And we as humans don't deal with big abstract questions. Well, that goal question should change every time your audience does. I frame this, and I do mention it in the book, from a perspective that your audience is smart, capable, and good. If the people whose minds or behavior you're trying to change, what question are they asking? Because that's where your message has to start.
Here.
I'm delighted, Gaurav. Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure is all mine. The day I picked up this book of yours, I became your raving fan. And I knew it that I have to bring you on this podcast, Find Your Red Thread.
I appreciate that.
And thank you for writing this book.
It was my first book, and it was a book I couldn't not write. I know that's a lot of negatives, but it was one of those things that I just really needed to, I wanted to get it out there because it seemed to solve a lot of challenges that I saw other people have. And I knew from experimenting with it and testing it over, by the time I wrote the book, over about 5 or 6 years, I knew it worked to help people really make sense of things, or to help things make sense to other people. And so it was, once I finally sat down to write it, it was a book that in a lot of ways wrote itself, which is not to say it was easy, but it was just, I felt very compelled to write it.
Yeah. Tamsen, while I was going through this book, and I could sense that how this book could be a Bible for the marketeers, for the advertisers. It could be a Bible for the startup founders. It could be a Bible for people who are just venturing into entrepreneurs. A part of me said, this could be a Bible for senior executives as well, working in the corporate. And especially I'm talking about people who are in their mid-40s, who might be dealing with what we call as midlife crisis, people who might be at the CXO's level, CXO position or CXO -1. They know they are doing extremely well because the audience of this podcast, they are in that bracket and they're doing extremely well for themselves. And yet a part of them is asking them, what after that?
What's next?
What after this corporate career?
Yeah.
And the moment I had this question, the response came to me is, hey, what's the idea that you're working on now that might help you to stay relevant once you say goodbye to the corporate world? And finding that idea, I personally believe, is extremely difficult. And the book talks about make your big ideas irresistible.
Yes, which assumes you have one to start. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Well, I do believe everyone has one. And I believe that anyone who has spent as long in their career to get to that CXO or CXO -1 position, there is a reason why you have stayed in your field of practice or in your functional area or in your industry or your vertical for as long as you have, because there is something in it about it that you find intrinsically rewarding. And really, when it comes to figuring out what's next, whether that's just the next position or whether that's the next phase of your life and career, I think it really comes down to starting to tease out what is that commonality that's been present
Hmm.
in all of those positions, in all of those functions that you've engaged in, and really start to tease that out, because once you've got that, that can start to serve as a North Star and a guidance system for where to go
Yeah.
next.
Yeah. This is so interesting. Especially I was talking to this gentleman who has been at the CXO-1 position. And while I was observing the way he's interacting with people, I could sense the calmness that he brings in.
Mm.
And during
Yeah.
one such conversation, I asked him, I said, what do you think is your superpower? What is the gift that you've been blessed with that you can use to serve other people? And he said, I don't
Mm.
know.
Mm.
And there I was sitting and wondering, how is this person not been able to identify the
Well,
calmness that
because
he's bringing in the room?
Because if it's your operating system, you're not aware of it, right? So one of the ways that I often have referred to the red thread is that it is our operating system. But a computer isn't conscious of its code, right? It just reads it. And really, we only see the code of a computer or of a website, let's say, for instance, when you go into a window to go and look at it. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what I see the work that I do with clients, and that's what the red thread book and the method is all about, is really opening that window on your operating system so that you can start to see, what is it that I do over and over again that seems to come easy to me. I don't even realize it's a special thing because it's just so much a part of who I am and how I operate that it doesn't occur to me that that's not how everybody else is. I think that can be a very powerful thing.
Yeah. I was introduced to this word called superpower and gifts by one of my teachers. His name is Rajesh. And he tells me, Gaurav, what is your superpower? And I said, I don't find one. After a few conversations, he introduced this word, Gaurav, I find you as somebody who has the ability to extract wisdom from people. I said, what does that mean? That's such a silly thing. I don't think that's
No.
something which is superpower. And he said, that comes naturally to you. That's the reason why you are saying it's a small thing. It is not. So one thing what you just mentioned, Tamsen, is why have you stayed in the vertical in the area for so long, right? And what is the intrinsic reward that you're getting out of that? That's one. Second thing is decoding the operating system that you have.
Yep.
What are the other ways that could help people to identify their core gifts, their superpowers?
I separated two things, right? Because there is the core gifts and superpowers, which I think are the skills and talents that you can apply towards whatever it is that has kept you in there doing whatever it is that you do so long. So for instance, I've never seen a thing that I can't figure out a process for. I am I'm a high structure builder, as learning theorists would call it. I can make frames and processes. I can make things make sense. And I started to figure that out because that's what people repeatedly came to me for. Can you help me? How do I talk about this? How do I explain this? Can you give me or because in the roles that I spent for much of my career in branding, marketing, messaging, sales messaging, that kind of thing, I was in the position of helping other people make sometimes fairly, ephemeral, squishy things make sense to people. What is the spirit of this organization? Or why does this massively rich organization need money? Or what does it mean to have made this scientific discovery? Or how is this new approach different than everything else that's out there? Those are kind of amorphous things. And I just found over and over again that people came to me to help figure out, it makes sense to me. How do I make it make sense to other people? So I would say that one of the ways to look at for those gifts and those superpowers is to say, what is it that people seem to come to me for, and they don't seem to go to other people for that same thing, right? So what are you kind of known for? What's the kind of question that people bring to you? I think is one of the ways to really find where your superpowers are.
Wow. What kind of questions people come to me for? And what do people come to me for? What a beautiful way to look at that. Tamsen, I do understand that in the world where we live in, we are rewarded for what we bring on table. And there are certain skills and the behavior patterns
Yep.
which are celebrated in the corporate world. For example, your ability to communicate, your ability to sell, your ability to make decisions, your ability to negotiate, your ability to think out of the box, your ability to do design thinking. What do you think? What are the other traits? What are equally important and yet are not spoken about in the corporate
Oh
world?
gosh, yes. Okay. Well, I would say that underlying all of that is, obviously I'm biased here, is persuasive message design. Your
Hmm.
ability to articulate in a persuasive way your point of view to build an emotional, intellectual, eventually financial or effort investment, resource investment. And it is not taught. I mean, it is just not. I mean, I think, and what's interesting to me, when you talk about, when you listed those skills off, communication, I mean, negotiation is taught, but communication skills really aren't. I mean, I spent 6 years in business school, and it's not taught. It's not taught. Like, the philosophies of it aren't taught. Sales is a certain kind of messaging. Marketing and PR and advertising are different kinds of messaging. But when any of us are in organizations and in enterprises, I would say being able to have a clearly articulated, persuasive conversation is something that you probably have at least daily, if not hourly, where you
Hmm.
need to explain something. You're asking somebody of something of somebody. You're asking them to do something, to think something. And many, many times you're asking them to do, think, behave differently than they have been up to that point. Even if it's just, could you support this? Can I do
Hmm.
this? Would you stop doing this? And yet so often the ways that we approach that are profoundly unsuited
Hmm.
to actual persuasion. This is the soapbox I'm happy to get on. But I think that that for me is I really see that as one of my driving forces on this planet, is to really demystify and decode, like, what's going on, what needs to happen, and how do you do that so that these big ideas that people have, these big gifts, these gifts that they can give,
Hmm.
don't get lost in translation. And I
Hmm.
mean that almost literally, because so often it's our inability to explain why something is important, or even what it is, or how it aligns with what somebody believes or wants. It's our inability to do that that kills an idea, kills
Yeah.
our ability to apply right there.
Yeah. I often tell people that in any conversation, if the conversation is stirring more questions in you,
Mm.
take it the conversation is going in the right direction. So what you just mentioned had stirred more questions in me. As much as it sounds very easy, hey, tell them what you would like to tell them, and then
Yeah.
make sure that you support it with the right testimonials and back it up with the right data. And that's how you should be communicating your idea. That's one. And if it's as simple as that, what do you think? Where do leaders falter? And what are the assumptions they operate from
Yeah.
that don't support them to convey their message, their idea in a irresistible way?
Okay. Yes, you have just landed in what has been my favorite topic for the last 18 months. I've gone deep on this, and I'm very excited about, like, what some of the things what I think that I'm seeing, and I'm looking for how I can start to get more empirical research to back this up. So one of the ways that you just explained how to communicate was to be able to clearly articulate your idea and then be able to supply the evidence that backs it up. That is the common advice, right? That is traditional academic formulation of persuasion. It's certainly what I was taught as a I mean, I had to give a persuasive speech to graduate from high school, and that was the format.
Hmm.
But it is one kind of argument, to go rather geeky here. That's inductive reasoning.
Yeah.
It is basically saying, here's my conclusion, let me defend it.
Yeah. Very
But
rhetoric way of having a
yeah, it
conversation.
is
Yeah.
right. And it works in certain situations, and it's necessary, except that it's generally not so good with really new ideas, for a couple different reasons. One is that generally with a truly new idea, there isn't enough pre-existing context for people
Yeah.
to make sense of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Two, the evidence, and this is true actually for any kind of inductive argument where you say, here's my conclusion, let me defend it. Everybody says it's great. Here's my evidence. Here's my testimonials. Here's our financials. Again, I am not saying don't do this, but it relies on the audience, for lack of better word here, to kind of trust that those things are true. So your conclusion will be right if your evidence is true. And so it's very much putting the risk on the audience to say whether or not, it's like asking for a leap of faith. Your conclusion might be true if your evidence is true.
Yeah.
Well, I don't like those odds, given the work that I do and the kinds of ideas I work with. And so I was like, well, what else is there? Well, there's another kind of argument, and that's deductive. And that's basically where you're starting with things that people agree are true, not might be true. You agree are true.
Okay.
Things like seeing is believing, or that connection creates community, or you're surfacing core operating principles of either the enterprise or the individual. And you're saying essentially, because this is true, and because this is true, this is the conclusion I've drawn.
Okay.
And by starting there, you are getting people to agree with the approach before you're ever introducing kind of the other piece. So I am of the belief, again, working to do some research to back this up, because I've seen it, I have seen it in experience. I have seen it work through the testing that I've seen with my clients. But really what it is this combination of starting with, can we find points of agreement about basic operating principles? And then once you've reached agreement in principle on the conclusion, then you back it up with your evidence, with your testimonials, and this is how and why we can actually deliver on that. So that's not what we're taught. And I am all about teaching that right now.
Yeah. And so I think what I'm picking up right now is, Tamsen, it's very important to have some basic ground where we can bring in agreements between yourself and the audience that you are interacting with, making so much sense to me. Because if the initial ground itself is where we are debating, or where I'm making an effort to get a buy-in from you, then the whole journey would be very tiresome. Now, what do you think? What are the assumptions that the leaders that you've worked with, they operate from, that don't allow them to operate and start from this space?
I think there's a lot of well-known cognitive biases that get in the way. Two immediately come to mind. One is what's known as the false consensus effect, which is the belief that everybody sees the world the way that we do. It's a time and effort saving fallback of our brain to just say, it's just a lot easier to operate from the initial assumption that everybody thinks the same way that you do until you're presented with evidence otherwise.
Yeah, it's
when you're trying to argue for something or create a change, though, that can be deadly, because you may be trying to, and I see this a lot with like my startup clients, for instance. If you have already decided your conclusion is right, then you are arguing from the position that it is already right. And I know that that sounds self-referential, but we forget that you're talking to someone who has to come to the conclusion themselves that your conclusion is right. And if they don't do that, then that's very, very difficult. So that's one of the primary ones, is that false consensus effect.
That one, if you're operating from a space that the world sees the world, everyone else in the room, they look at the world the way I look at the world, I think that's a sure, short way, tried and tested way to fail.
Yes. So it's one of my mantras that I have for myself, but I share with my clients, is seek to disconfirm. Seek to disconfirm what you believe to be true. You should, anytime that you're sure that you have a great idea, you should, once you start to see that it works, your efforts should then be directed at trying to poke as many holes in it as possible. I remember reading one time that McKinsey, like what part of their approach when they're working and consulting with companies and leaders is to ask up front, if this fails, why would it fail? Because most people actually do have a sense, if they stop and think about it, at where the weak points are. We just don't stop and think about it. And so seeking to disconfirm is a great way to counter that false consensus effect, because it basically says, well, I believe this.
Hmm.
Do you believe this? And just even being able to operate that and have that point of engagement and interaction has a couple benefits. One, it will show you if there's not alignment and there is disagreement, and gives you an
Bang on.
opportunity to correct or adjust or retreat.
Yeah.
But second, it's an inherently respectful move. It's not a trick or a technique. It's just a legitimately,
Yeah.
I don't know what you think, and I am not going to presume to know what you think. So, but I'm
Beautiful.
going to tell you what I think, so that if I am
Beautiful.
trying to get you to do something different, I'm taking that new risk on myself.
Yeah. I think I just love it when you said that seek to disconfirm. And I think that could be one of the ways that could help us to freeze on the idea that I would like to take to the world, right? Because
Yeah.
that's a question that I
Yeah.
asked you. How do you know that that's an idea that you would like to work on?
Yeah. I'm not a woo-woo person is the term that I know some people do. I have a good friend of mine, Laura Belgray, who says that she is woo adjacent. And I like that because, for me, we can look at this as rationally as possible, and I would say that my favorite rational way of finding the idea that you want to keep pursuing and you want to keep testing, the first place to start is actually inspired by the essayist Alain de Botton, which I'm sure I've wrecked the French, who in a book about travel, of all things,
Hmm.
brought up this idea that each of us spends much of our lives seeking to answer certain questions.
Yeah.
And I love that as a framing device for figuring out what this idea is that you're there for, which is, what question do I seek to
Hmm.
answer? And I think that's a lovely pair with when we were talking before about how to identify your gifts, right? Your idea often will follow the path of, what question do I seek to answer? And then the idea is, what is my answer to that? Or it's a perpetual search. And it's a lovely pair with, what questions do people bring you? Because one is what you're seeking, and the other one is what you bring to it in order to help find that answer.
Yeah. I just love it, Tamsen, the way you are responding and how easy you are able to make it for our audience to understand. Hey, what's a big idea that you would like to work on? One, revisit. Why have you stayed in the area, the vertical, the department, the industry that you have stayed for so long? That's one.
Yeah.
Second is revisit your operating system. Third one is, what do people come to you for? What kind of questions do they bring? And the powerful bomb that you've just thrown at us is, what question are you seeking to answer? And I think as much as it sounds easy, it's $1 million question, and you might not find that answer in just one go. You will not find that question in one go.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, so I love the work of Simon Sinek. I think his work on why is and purpose is very good and important, because we need to know that. And in a lot of ways, that's where this question can lead you. So like, why am I doing this? Because I want to know the answer to this question, or that I'm seeking to help people with this question. But it can be very, as we know, most people know, it can be very hard when you're just like, what is my why? Like this giant, big question. And we as humans don't deal with big abstract questions that well. So what I have found is to actually take it down to a very specific use case, right? So, and that's helpful for me with the work that I do, because a lot of times people are saying, well, I need to message this change, or I'm trying to, get investment for my startup, or, we're trying to enter a new market and we need a new vertical to see why we're important. And what ends up happening is, by saying, okay, let's take it to this specific case. And then we start to say, and then I flip it a little bit. I say, of the people that you need to act, if the people whose minds or behavior you're trying to change, what question are they asking? Because that's where your message has to start. If your message doesn't start with a question that they're asking, you'll never establish the relevance that's necessary to create, to engage the attention and create the alignment you're looking for. And here's the secret of that. That's your question. You are going to be drawn over and over and over again to answer that question. So if I'm looking at my own work, for instance, just all over the years, if I'm looking at different applications of, whether it was marketing, or, the years that I spent moonlighting as a weight loss coach, or, The time that I've spent working with a major TEDx event, ultimately, over and over again, the audience question that I was trying to figure out was some version of, how do I make this idea irresistible to someone? How do I get buy-in for it? How do I make it not just make sense, but make enough sense that people believe enough in it to act on it?
Yeah.
Everything that I have done in my career, any job that I've been truly happy with, let me put it that way, has been exploring some aspect of that question.
Beautiful. Beautiful, Tamsen. Tamsen, as much as I'm just picking up what you said, is it how to make big ideas irresistible, or is it how to communicate your ideas so that they become irresistible?
So, and I think that I don't know that there's much difference, frankly, because to quote Agatha Christie, words are the outer clothing of ideas.
Yeah.
To me, it's a self-reinforcing thing. If
Yeah.
the screenwriter Robert McKee says, you may think you know, but you won't know until you try to write it down. And I think
Yeah.
the same can be true of saying something out loud. There are ideas that make perfect sense in our heads, and then when we try to
But when you-
explain them to people, they don't.
Yeah. Why I'm asking this, because you picked up a beautiful case study of Simon Sinek. With due respect to him, when I read his book, I was in awe of him. I was in awe of the concept, why you do what you do.
Yeah.
Find your why.
Yeah.
And when I started doing my own research, I realized that is not the first time somebody has spoken about finding your purpose. And yet the way he presented that, it made so much sense to the audience that he was trying to reach out to build the brand that he's been able to build for himself.
Yeah.
The kind of authority that he has been wanted to establish for himself.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that there are wonderful lessons in there, because it's a lot of the work that either I'm doing with my clients or in the project that I'm launching this year, really trying to help people understand how to do it themselves, is that when we can take something back to its simplest underlying structure, we are able to engage an extraordinary amount of power around our idea. And what I mean by that is, instead of using words or concepts that people didn't understand or that required him to have to explain them, start with why. It's just so dead simple. Yeah, I think it's because he was able to find that simple structure under everything else. And
Precisely.
to me, that's the key to understanding that high level, what's your idea? I think ideas are inherently engaging. If you are engaged in your idea, it's engaging. It's engaged you. And if you believe in it, and if it keeps you going, if it keeps you in your career, if it keeps you at a company, if it keeps you researching or doing this as your side project for years and years and years, it's because there is something deeply engaging about it.
Yeah.
And if you're in the position of needing other people to be deeply engaged, it's about translating that, what you find engaging about it,
Beautiful,
out to other people so that they can be equally engaged. And what I'm finding over and over again is, the secret is even when it's a new idea, is to base it on old things. And what I mean by that are things that already exist, meaning anchor a new idea in what somebody already wants, anchor your argument for it in what they already believe, because those are things, what people want and what they believe, that people are already invested in. They're already bought into, which means you've reduced an extraordinary amount of work on yourself.
Yeah.
If you argue for your idea based on those things that they've already bought into, even if it's a completely new idea.
And also, I think because this will help us to stand on the same platform that you were talking about, the platform of the point of agreement.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And now I've been able to connect the dots. When I read the book by Simon Sinek on Start With Why, or What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith, there's nothing out of the world that they brought in. However, they anchored their idea on the old things that have already been spoken about, that have served humanity for the longest period of time. When we have senior leaders who are already working in the corporate arena, even they have to communicate an idea to their team members, to their stakeholders, to their board of directors. So, Tamsen, if you were to help us draw a pathway that could help us to, hey, these are the 4 steps, these are the 3 steps, these are the 2 steps or 6 steps that could help us to
Yep.
communicate our big ideas, what would you
Yes.
suggest?
Well, those happen to be the steps in the red thread. So I think the very first one, everything starts with anchor that whatever that idea is, that thing is that you're talking to your audience about, whoever they might be, and something that you are fairly sure that your audience already wants, and a question your audience is already asking. Not the real problem that you know is there, not the real question they should be asking. I mean, the actual question that they're asking right now. So, for instance, I had a client that they were trying to get it was a nonprofit media company. They're trying to get their board to fund a new position. And when you're trying to figure out, well, how do we balance, like we're asking for more money? What do you know the board is always going to be engaged in and engaged by? Well, they're at a nonprofit, they're always going to be actively seeking new and better ways to deliver on that mission. So you can anchor a new idea into saying, we want to be here to talk to you about this project that we think is worthy investment because we believe it will, what does the audience want? Help us deliver more effectively on our mission to more people. Okay, now I'm listening, right? And so then from there, it's establishing that anchor point of what the audience wants. And then from there, that's how you start to introduce the real problem. There's a lot of things that can happen there. We can spend some time, but the issue there is to say, hey, there is a reason why there has been some challenge about answering that question or achieving that goal or solving that problem so far. And generally what I find with business messaging is there is some kind of unresolved tension that needs to be solved first, right? So for instance, back to the nonprofit media company, we identified that there was a tension between content, what we call content output, what they were putting out and how much they were putting out as far as, this is again, a public media. Think of your local public radio station, in the US, it's, PBS stations or NPR. And it's just like, put out good content, good content, good content. And this position that they wanted to invest in, they really saw as actually helping to reach new audiences. So the tension was, there's nothing wrong with focusing on high quality content that we're putting out there. But if it's not exposed to people, if we don't have the content exposure that we need, we are not able to deliver on the mission the way that we need to. In other words, there's this tension between the production of the content and the consumption and the distribution of the content.
Yeah.
And so we say, okay, so we really need to figure out how do we work on content exposure. We need to get more people to see this content. And so they were looking for support for something that they had already done a test of. And they're saying, hey, people are subscribing to this newsletter, which is a new form of content that's getting to new people. And because it's generating subscriptions, it's actually generating more revenue. And the more revenue we generate, the more that we can cycle that back into our content output. So in other words, here's this new position, but because it not only expands our content exposure, but also monetizes that, it can actually help us deliver better on both our missions, our mission for content and our nonprofit mission of let's make sure that we're hitting the bottom line. None of that is like new information or saying, hey, you were doing something wrong. It's saying there's this tension that we have to solve. So indirectly, I gave the other pieces, but so there's this problem that has to be solved. And then there's one other piece of I call it the truth, but there's a principle that the audience would agree is true that makes that problem impossible to ignore. It could be framed as the more people who see our content, the more power it can have. So therefore, we need to, and this is the change piece. So it's only after that point that you introduce your idea. We want this. This is this is the tension that has to be solved. This is why it's such a problem. And so therefore, this kind of solution will help solve it. And then you need to follow with how does that happen? And you also need to implement and execute on it. But it's that what I call goal, audience goal, problem, tension that has to be resolved, truth, inarguable principle that supports your point of view, change your core idea, and then the actions that support it. Like that order will help make sure that you're not skipping any steps that your audience's brain needs to A, understand, and B, find those points of alignment.
Yeah. So goal, problem, truth, change, and action.
Yep.
Right. I do understand that when you're speaking about the goal, I do understand that there is something that the audience wants. You
Yep.
anchor those new ideas on that, and that's how you'll be able to sail through. World that we have been taught.
Smoother sales. Yes, exactly.
Smoother
I can't promise
sales,
it
right.
always works, but yeah, because
Yeah.
it does depend on, how well people align with those underlying principles that you're explaining, why that problem is such a problem
Yeah.
and what that truth is. If they don't agree
Yeah.
with those, and that's what
Yeah.
your argument is based on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm listening right now is when as a leader, when you are interacting with your board of directors, when you are interacting with your seniors who are asking for results, who might be chasing you for what kind of ROIs the organization is able to produce, that conversation would be very different from when the person is interacting and dealing with team members who are reporting into them, because their expectations from this person's role is very different from the people who are reporting into him or her. Their expectation would be very different, right? And that's
right.
how every conversation would be different. Is my understanding right?
It would, yeah. I mean, what that means is that at least the beginning point of the conversation should change. That goal question should change every time your audience does. Because you're right. If I'm speaking to my boss in an organization, they are probably looking at strategic impact, return on investment, speed to scale and impact, those kinds of things. My team coming up, they're going to be looking at, and I would need to be explaining to them things that are probably much more focused on their individual desires, needs, as team members, as employees, et cetera, and how this particular change does or doesn't align with that as well. What I find, though, is that when we get to these underlying principles, that almost always the underlying argument is still the same. It's, let me find in what is present in my idea that satisfies you and what you want and what you believe.
Wow. Wow. And I'm sure it requires a lot of introspection, a lot of work, and we need to have very big, clean ears so that we can absorb the message from our audience as purely as in the neutral space as possible. Otherwise, we are going to color it, and then we'll get into that space. You know what? I heard it. I gave them what they wanted, and yet they are not buying it now.
Yes. I got that question from one of my newsletter subscribers yesterday. They said, well, sometimes people just ignore the best ideas. I was like, yeah, for me, there's a couple of big reasons for that. One is everything starts with understanding. And there's kind of two different aspects of understanding that can get in the way. One is they don't understand how it's relevant.
Yeah.
Right. Like they just don't understand how the idea is relevant. And there's so many messages and brands and, oh my gosh, don't even get me started on, this is a just absolute epidemic in advertising where they try to be mysterious. And it's like, if I don't know what this thing does for me or why I would care, I am not going to take the time to explore it. So one of those is they don't understand the relevance. And the second form of understanding is that whatever is said is absolutely incomprehensible to them, either because it's stated in such a way where someone doesn't recognize the concepts are pitched at an expertise level or a technical level that somebody isn't familiar with, or of a complexity that somebody just is like, I can't. And then so that's, I think those are kind of the two big places that ideas, explanations, persuasion fails. But then the last one is, even if something is beautifully, clear, relevant, gorgeously structured, if it's not aligned with someone, if they don't want that, if it's based on fundamental principles that somebody doesn't agree with, once they understand, that's it. Like it's done. Like you either choose, that means that something has to change, right? Either you're going to give up on that person's action or involvement, or depending on where you are in the organization, that might mean that you need to go back to the drawing board. If not with your message, then with maybe the product or the idea.
Yeah, precisely. The second thing that you spoke about is the unresolved tension that you're able to identify. And I personally believe, Tamsen, identifying and finding or discovering a problem, that, unresolved tension, that itself is a humongous task. Because what most of the time people talk about is the symptom of something that has not been solved yet.
Yes.
So
yes.
what is required for a leader to discover that unresolved tension with the audience that they are dealing with?
Yeah. So I think this is a nearly perennial problem for leaders. It certainly has been in sales since the introduction of the Challenger sale, 10, 15 years ago, because there was rightly this focus on offering insights that challenged thinking and behavior about where the solution was, where the real problem might be, et cetera. And learning theory supports that, right? So, there's a learning theory called transformative learning, which it starts with, in order for us to truly transform our thinking, it has to start with this kind of disrupting incident where all of a sudden our assumptions are challenged. So we know that's necessary. But the problem ever since was like, how do we figure out what those insights are? And, many a consulting practice has been based on like, we can find those insights. And that's a problem I've been trying to solve as well. So the book outlines one methodology for it. And it follows that kind of story narrative arc of saying, okay, if this is the question that people have, then the first step of establishing what that tension is saying, where are people looking for this problem, for the answer to this problem? So, for instance, I have a client who works with leaders, and the question that he seeks to answer with leaders is, how do we successfully execute like a strategic leap? We're trying to make a big difference, a transformative, change in the company. How do we do that? And his perspective, if we're saying, okay, well, where do people kind of fall apart there? And oftentimes it's that they're looking on, well, what do we need to do? Right? What are the outcomes that how do we achieve those outcomes? And that's not wrong. It makes sense. If you're trying to successfully navigate a leap, you've got to focus on goals and outcomes and all of that kind of stuff. But his point is, but we have to, and then the next piece is, okay, but if you only focus on goals and outcomes, what do you miss? And for him, it's like, well, you miss accountability. So that's that tension between outcomes and accountability, because, and this is where this kind of what I call the problem principle comes in, because his definition of accountability is the ownership of outcomes. So if we're paying attention to outcomes, but we're not making sure that anybody actually has ownership of them, we're not going to get that question answered. So kind of following a narrative path that way can sometimes be a very, very helpful thing. So what question, where do people look for the answer right now? If they only look there, what do they miss? And it's not your answer, by the way. It's an aspect, it's an element of your answer. Which leads me to the other way to find it, which I have actually found to be, just because of how we humans are wired, I've found it to be a little bit faster for people. Let me just talk to you, Gaurav. Let's say you have this question, and this question is what your audience is asking. The question for you to figure out where that tension is to actually say, all right, if I were asking this question of my client and I said, okay, great. So when it comes to navigating or successfully executing a strategic leap, what do you believe to your core must be there? And he was like, well, scale has to be, like, everything has to be happening all the way through the organization. Great. Scale. Super. And so the tension would be, and what are people focused on if not scale? Right? So it could be kind of like single leaderships or something like that. So, and he could have answered the same question with accountability, because his answer is the best way to navigate a strategic leap is to scale accountability. So by looking and saying, what do I believe to my core must be part of this answer? Great. I believe that accountability must be part of this answer.
Beautiful.
So where are people focused? Outcomes. That's the tension.
Yeah. So, Tamsen, when you work with leaders to help them implement this goal, problem, truth, change, and actions framework that could help them to make their ideas irresistible, what kinds of resistance do you experience from them?
I don't think a lot of times it's really conscious resistance, because anybody who's coming to me already values getting buy-in for a change. I mean, I lead with that. Like On my homepage, it says build messages that build buy-in. So if somebody doesn't actually care about like how people respond to this, they are not my client. Which, by the way, is a really powerful reason to identify this question that you answer. I often refer to it as a qualifying question, because once you say, like as I do about my work, then I answer the question, how do I build buy-in, or how do I build a message that builds buy-in? I'm very clearly defining who my audience is and who it isn't. And my audience is anyone who has that question. And my audience is not anyone who does not, right? So if somebody doesn't care about buy-in for a change, not my person. So so generally the resistance isn't really like, I disagree. It's more, it's that we jump to the conclusion. So a lot of times if I say, well, what's the answer? Well, they should be doing this idea. And it's like, but that's the conclusion to the answer. You're saying the best way to do this is that. But that's just an assertion, right? You're asking someone to take a leap of faith. You're giving them a conclusion without any argument. And that's when we start benefit bombing people, right? That's when we're like, well, and if I say why, they're like, well, because it provides this benefit and this benefit. I'm like, you haven't explained to me why that conclusion delivers on that problem. You haven't told me how. So this is where I see my work linking with Simon Sinek's work, which is he so beautifully established why it was so important to articulate the why behind your what, the why behind what you do. But what I find with my red thread process and this process of finding your core case for something and your core story for something is that it helps articulate the why behind your how, why behind how you do what you do.
What you do. Wow.
And ultimately, when it comes to building buy-in, it's not just on the why that people have to feel aligned. It's on the how. Because if I don't agree with how you achieve certain ends, we're not going to get there. Even if I agree that the outcome is a good one, if I don't agree with your methodology, and if I don't agree with the principle or the ethos that brought you there, it's not going to work long term.
So why behind what? Let me put it this way. Why behind how is equally important as much as you have a why behind what.
I agree. I believe so. Yes.
Yeah.
You can't go if two people don't agree on the outcome on why you're doing something, or the kind of ultimate driver, like we believe in innovation. If you don't believe in innovation, we got a problem.
Yeah.
But if I don't agree with the way that you achieve motivation, like innovation, then that's not going to work. And I think almost all of us have had some experience, let's say working for a company where we started working there because we believed in what they do. We believed, and we may even believe in why they do it. But we may have left that company because eventually we didn't agree with how they got it done.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's where we have this, this is where I think it's so important to really like kind of put an X-ray on that, because we have to go back to that operating system and say, what is it that is actually driving what we do? So, Jim Duterte of University of Virginia calls these the deep rules of the organization. And they're kind of the organizational principle version of like Ray Dalio's principles, but it's like these deep-rooted operating assumptions about the business or yourself and why you do what you do.
Thank you, Tamsen. Tamsen, I'm just wondering what theme of the book, Find Your Red Thread, that I have not shown my curiosity that you think is important for the corporate leaders?
I think it's one of those things where it's a subtle point in that book. It's a not so subtle point in my next one. I can tell you that, of assuming the best of the people that you're talking to. And so I frame this, and I do mention it in the book, that you need to start from a perspective that your audience is smart, capable, and good. And the reason why is because one of the primary drivers of people's decisions is because they want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. They may or may not believe it of themselves, but you can pretty much rely on the fact that somebody wants to be seen as smart, capable, and good. And I think that starting from that perspective that somebody already is really important, because a huge amount of persuasive messaging in sales and marketing starts a position that it's conditional, that you will be smart, you will be good, you will be capable if you do this. But the nature of your messaging and the nature of its success will change radically when you start from the perspective that your folks already are smart,
Yeah.
capable, and good.
What a brilliant way to live life. I think it's not only when you are interacting with your audience, when you're dealing with your customers. I think it's a beautiful way to deal with anyone in your life. If you're operating from a space that the people that you are interacting with, they are smart, capable, and good, I think life becomes good. Tamsen, thank you so much for
welcome.
being so generous and open in sharing. And I look forward to interacting with you more.
Oh, my pleasure, Garv. This was a joy. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much.